My son sent me his 23andMe results, excited about his heritage. I looked at the matches and my heart stopped because the text arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I know the exact time because I still remember the small jolt of my phone buzzing against the mahogany desk. That particular desk I'd owned for 11 years, the one with the scratch along the right edge from a careless moving company, and the brass lamp that had witnessed more late nights than I could count. I was in my home office in Bridgeland, still wearing my dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, surrounded by acquisition contracts for a commercial portfolio. We were evaluating in the southeast quadrant of the city. The contract smelled like fresh toner. The lamp threw a warm circle of light across the pages. Outside, Calgary in October held that particular stillness that descends after 9 o'clock when the traffic thins and the Bow River seems to breathe a little easier. My phone lit up with my son's name. "Dad, just got my 23andMe results. This is so cool. Can I send you the matches?" I read the message once, then I read it again, and I sat very still for 37 seconds. I know it was 37 because I counted, some deep animal instinct in me measuring the seconds the way you measure distance from a strike of lightning to the sound of thunder, trying to calculate how close the danger is. In those 37 seconds, my mind did not go blank. It did the opposite. It performed with the involuntary efficiency of a machine that has been quietly running a background process for decades, a rapid inventory of everything that stood between my son's excitement and the truth underneath it. I thought of a summer afternoon in 1997 when my father had stood behind the service counter of the second restaurant location and said, without looking up from the accounts he was reviewing, that the Chen name was going to mean something in this city one day. Not just food, but business, real estate, something that lasted. I thought of the specific weight of the restaurant keys I had pressed into my uncle's palm in the winter of 1998, keys that opened 3 locations I would never walk through again, that felt heavier leaving my hand than they had any rational right to feel. I thought of the affidavit I had signed at a lawyer's office in downtown Calgary in March of 1999, a document of perhaps 800 words that formalized a new version of a name I had carried since birth, the middle names quietly excised, a small surgical removal that felt enormous in the leather chair of that office, but had never once caused a question in 28 years. Because nobody in my Calgary life had any reason to ask. And I thought about my son Marcus, who was 23 years old and had my analytical exactitude and his mother's warmth, and who had just discovered 47 people who shared his blood and who was breathless with the excitement of it. And I thought, the distance between where he is right now and where this will eventually lead is exactly as long as I choose to make it. 37 seconds, and then I picked up the phone. In my professional life, I'm known for being unshakable. That is not an accident. It is something I constructed deliberately, the way you pour a foundation, layer by layer, with precision and intention, because I understood from a young age that composure was currency. The men and women I worked with at North Point Capital, the clients whose fortunes we grew, the partners who sat across from me during the most contentious negotiations imaginable. They all spoke about David Chen's steadiness, the way you speak about a natural phenomenon, like it had always been there, like it was geological. I had walked into boardrooms where the tension was so thick it had physical weight and said the uncomfortable truth that nobody else would say, and I had done it without my voice rising or my hands trembling. I had a TED Talk with 2-3 million views about ethical investing, about transparency, about the corrosive cost of concealment in business culture. I had said those words into a camera with complete conviction, because in my professional life, they were true. The TED Talk had been filmed 3 years earlier, at a conference in Toronto. I had spent 6 weeks preparing it, which is longer than I've spent preparing most things. and I want to be precise about why. Not because I doubted the material, but because I wanted to be sure. Standing on that stage under those lights with a camera capturing everything, that I was not a fraud. I had tested each argument against my own internal record. Each claim about the cost of concealment, each assertion about the inevitability of eventual disclosure, each case study drawn from businesses I had watched collapse under the weight of their own undisclosed liabilities. I had examined each of these through the lens of my own private history and asked myself honestly whether the principle applied. And I had decided that it did apply, and that I was not a fraud because the domain of my concealment was personal rather than professional, and I had made a sincere, perhaps motivated, distinction between those two territories that had held up under self-examination for 28 years, or seemed to hold up. The distinction was more comfortable to examine from a distance of 28 years than it would have been from, say, 2 months. But sitting in my home office on that Tuesday night in October, with my son's text glowing on my phone screen, I felt something I had kept carefully buried for 28 years shift beneath me like a geological plate, enormous and slow and impossible to stop. I typed back, "Sure, son. Send them over." Then I set the phone face down on the desk, pressed my palms flat against the cool mahogany, and breathed. The office was quiet in the specific way that rooms become quiet when you've been working in them for hours and the rest of the house has settled into sleep. The brass lamp, the smell of toner. Through the window, a single streetlight on the corner threw its amber cone onto the brick of the sidewalk below. And I had looked at that cone of light on many late nights over many years, and it had always been simply part of the view. And now it was the thing my eyes fixed on, while the rest of my awareness turned inward toward the seismic shift I could feel happening in the deep architecture of my own life. Here is what Marcus did not know. Here is what nobody in my current life knew. Not my colleagues, not my business partners, not the members of the foundation board that bore our family name. What they knew was David Chen, 52 years old, senior partner at one of Calgary's most respected private equity firms. What they knew was the Bridgeland office and the Mount Royal house and the annual charity gala where Sarah and I stood in a receiving line and shook hands with people who believed they knew exactly who I was. What they knew was a man who had built something substantial and solid from the ground up, who had arrived in Calgary in his mid-20s with drive and a vision, and a name he'd legally changed before he ever set foot in Alberta. The name he'd changed from. I sat in my office and I thought about the person I'd been at 24 years old. Not older, not wiser. Just a young man who had made a desperate and permanent decision in a moment of pain and chosen to rebuild from the foundation up. My wife Sarah knew I had changed my name before we met. She knew I had left behind difficulties in my past, which was how I had described it to her in those early months of dating, and she had loved me enough to respect the doors I kept closed. Over 19 years of marriage, she had become expert at reading the topography of what I would and would not discuss, and she navigated it with a grace that still moved me when I thought about it. Sarah's grace was not passive. That is something I want to be clear about, because it would be easy to describe it as simply tolerant, as wifely acceptance, and that would miss the specific quality of what she offered. It was active and intentional and cost her something. I had seen it cost her in those early years, when her own family asked questions about my background, and she deflected with a smooth precision that she had developed entirely on her own because I had not asked her to cover for me. I had simply not given her the material to work with. I had seen her navigate conversations at parties where people asked which part of Vancouver I was from, and I had watched her listen to whatever partial answer I gave, and then find a way to redirect the conversation that felt entirely natural, with the skilled ease of someone who has practiced the maneuver until it requires no visible effort. She never asked me why, not once in 19 years of marriage, and the gift of that, the weight of what that kind of sustained, unconditional trust feels like when you are carrying a secret from everyone else, was something I had thought about often enough that it had worn a groove in me. My children, Marcus, 23, finishing his MBA at the University of Calgary, and Emma, 26, in the third year of her medical residency in Montreal, knew nothing at all about what came before their father was their father. I want to say something about who my children are, because they are central to everything that follows, and because they deserve to be described with the specificity they have earned. Emma had been a serious child who became an even more serious adult, and the seriousness was not the dour kind, but the kind that comes from being genuinely interested in everything and unwilling to do anything superficially. She had decided at 11 years old that she wanted to be a doctor, not from the abstract desire for prestige or income that motivates some students toward medicine, but because of a specific event. Her grandmother, Sarah's mother, had been misdiagnosed for 14 months before someone finally looked at the right set of symptoms in the right order and identified the actual problem. And Emma had asked me with the calm intensity of an 11-year-old who has been thinking about something for weeks, "Why didn't they look at the whole picture, Dad?" I had said that sometimes people looked at the most obvious thing first, and she had nodded once, decisively, and said, "I'm going to look at the whole picture." And she had. She was in her residency now, specializing in internal medicine, and she called me every Sunday. And sometimes we talked for an hour about everything from hospital politics to ancient history to the philosophical implications of a diagnosis she had made that week. She had not yet asked me, in any of those hours of conversation, about my family of origin, because she had read, with the same careful whole-picture intelligence she brought to everything, that this was a territory I did not open. She was waiting. I had known for years that she was waiting, and the knowledge of it was a specific patient pressure I had learned to live with. Marcus was different in disposition, but not in the quality of his engagement. Where Emma observed and accumulated, Marcus organized and acted. He had been a child who sorted his toys by category and then resorted them by color, and then tried to create a system that accounted for both simultaneously and was frustrated when it couldn't be done without compromise. He approached his MBA with the same systematic thoroughness, maintaining academic records that his professors described as formidably consistent, and taking on consulting projects during his degree that were so carefully structured they had been used as teaching examples in subsequent classes. He had my approach to analysis, the habit of looking for the underlying pattern beneath the surface data, of asking what the numbers mean rather than just what they say, and I recognized it in him with a complicated mixture of pride and something I can only describe as recognition-induced discomfort, the feeling you get when you see yourself clearly in someone else and understand all the implications of what you're seeing. The DNA match file finished downloading. I opened it. The first result made my throat close as efficiently as a hand wrapped around it. James M. Close family, first cousin. Lives in Vancouver, BC. I stared at that name for a long time. James, my brother's son, which meant my brother was alive. I'd known that much from peripheral internet searches I'd done over the years. The kind of searching you do with the browser in private mode, and the guilt of a person who isn't sure whether they want to find something or not. But it also meant something more immediate and destabilizing. It meant James had taken a DNA test. It meant he had uploaded his results to a matching database, which meant he was either curious about his own connections, or he was looking for something specific. Was he looking for me? Did he know I was in Calgary? The questions sat in me with a weight I had not expected to feel. I had believed for 28 years that I had made my peace with the specific shape of my absence, had told myself often enough that my departure had been, if not mutual, then at least not unwanted, that the silence from Vancouver was as much theirs as mine, that two parties can agree to a separation without using formal language to do so. But seeing James's name in that database, a name he had put there, an active choice, complicated the silence in ways I wasn't ready to articulate. I'd last seen James in the parking lot behind the third restaurant location, in a January so cold that the outdoor ventilation pipes were wrapped in insulation tape, in a confrontation that had lasted perhaps 12 minutes, and that I had replayed with varying degrees of detail and fairness to all parties involved, several thousand times over the intervening 28 years. He had been 28, I had been 24. We had both been frightened, and neither of us had used that word because we were the kinds of young men who were afraid that naming a feeling too precisely would somehow make it permanent. He had said what he said. I had heard what I heard. And I'd driven home in a car that smelled like takeout containers and had sat in my small apartment for 3 days before I made the decision I made. What I remembered most from those 3 days, more than the specific words James had used, more than the specific fear I was carrying, was a quality of stillness that I had never experienced before and have never quite experienced since. The kind of stillness that descends when you have reached the far edge of a coping strategy and realize the strategy has run out. I had been managing. That was the word I would have used at 24, though I understand now that it was not management but suppression. Managing the slow deterioration of the family business, the daily grinding conflict between my father and my uncle, the sense I had that I was simultaneously needed and redundant, present but ineffective, visible but not seen. And when James said what he said in that parking lot, something in me had gone quiet, in a way that felt at the time like defeat, but that I had gradually come to understand was something else. The very specific silence of a decision that has already been made before you're aware you've made it, Marcus called 3 minutes later. I answered on the second ring because anything else would have felt like flinching, and I don't flinch where my children can see it. "Dad, this is insane!" His voice carried that particular breathless energy he'd had since he was 7 years old, and discovered something that delighted him. It was one of my favorite sounds in the world. And standing there, hearing it while staring at James M., close family felt like holding something precious and something dangerous in the same two hands. I have family in Vancouver, and there's someone in Edmonton, someone in Winnipeg. We have relatives all over. Mum's side is so small, this is amazing. Can we reach out to them? I could hear Sarah in the background, her voice lifting with the question of what Marcus was so animated about. My wife, the woman who'd married a man she trusted completely, who had loved him for 19 years, without knowing that his trust was not quite symmetrical, that there was a portion of himself he had walled off and maintained in careful darkness, because the alternative, the full truth, had felt too large and too complicated to hand to another person. "Let's take it slow," I said. And my voice was what it always was, measured, present, giving nothing away. "These DNA tests can be complicated. Give me some time to look through the matches." "Sure, Dad. But isn't it incredible? I always felt like our family was so small. Now there's all these people." "It is incredible," I said, because it was exactly that. After we hung up, I turned off the brass lamp. I sat in the dark for an hour, not thinking exactly, more like watching the landscape of my own life from a great height, the way you look down from a plane at everything you thought was permanent and realize from altitude that it is smaller than you believed, and more fragile, and more surrounded by the vast geography of everything else. In the dark of that office, I permitted myself something I rarely allowed, an unstructured review. I did not impose analysis or sequence or the kind of ordered thinking that produced outcomes. I simply sat and let the memories come in whatever order they chose. The first restaurant opened in 1982 by my father and his brother, my Uncle George, in a strip mall on the east side of Vancouver. A modest space, 12 tables, a kitchen that was too small, a storage room where my father kept the business records in a locked drawer that he thought I didn't know the combination to. I was 7 years old when they opened it, and I remember the smell of paint that had not quite dried on the walls, and the way my mother arranged flowers from the farmer's market on each table, even though it was a Tuesday, and the restaurant was not yet technically open. I remember my father looking at those tables and those flowers and breathing out very slowly, a breath I understood even at 7 as the release of enormous tension, the sound of someone who has bet everything and is now waiting to see if the bet was right. The restaurant had worked. That was the thing. It had worked for years, not spectacularly, not in the way that produces profiles in business magazines, but steadily, reliably, the way a well-built machine keeps moving because its components are maintained and its fuel supply is consistent. By the time I was in high school, they had opened a second location. By the time I was in university, there were 3. My father worked 12-hour days with the particular driven quietness of a man who does not celebrate milestones because celebrating would mean pausing, and pausing would mean acknowledging how much further there still was to go. My Uncle George was different, louder, more social, the face of the business in ways my father was not built to be, and for many years the difference worked. They complemented each other in the specific way that siblings can when they understand each other's language well enough to fill the gaps. And then the gaps widened, as gaps between people under pressure have a tendency to do. By 1995, they were fighting about everything. By 1996, the fights had a new quality, less about specific decisions and more about fundamental visions. The kind of disagreement that doesn't resolve because it's not really about the immediate question, but about who the other person fundamentally is. My father wanted stability and consolidation. My uncle wanted growth and modernization. James, my uncle's son, was working in the business by then and aligned strongly with his father, which had an effect on my own position that I am still somewhat reluctant to examine too closely. It made me align, by default, with mine. I was not a natural businessman at 24. I want to be honest about that. The skills I developed later, the analytical rigor, the composed decision-making, the ability to see the essential pattern beneath the noise of data, were partly temperamental and partly built through hard experience, and at 24 I had the temperament without the experience, which is a particular combination that looks like potential but functions, in moments of crisis, more like paralysis. I watched the business deteriorate, and I did not know how to stop it. I made suggestions that nobody listened to, not because the suggestions were wrong. Some of them, in retrospect, were quite sound, but because in the architecture of a family business controlled by 2 older men who were already in conflict, the voice of a 24-year-old with a 30% inherited share carried approximately the weight you would expect it to carry. The irony was not lost on me. I want to be honest about that because irony is only useful if you're willing to look at it directly. I had built my entire professional reputation on transparency. My TED Talk, the one with 2-3 million views, the one my daughter had watched 4 times and told me she was proud of, was called The Price of Hidden Problems: Why Honest Accounting Builds Stronger Businesses. I had said into a camera with complete and genuine conviction that concealment is a tax you pay with compound interest, that every problem you bury grows at a rate you cannot predict, that the cost of disclosure up front is always cheaper than the cost of discovery later. I had believed every word when I said it. I believed it now, sitting in the dark. And yet, you do not have to be a hypocrite to be complicated. I had told myself that for 28 years, with varying degrees of success. The next morning at breakfast, Marcus had his laptop open before the coffee finished brewing. He had created a spreadsheet. This was so thoroughly, painfully, accurately Marcus that it almost made me laugh. This was a young man who had approached his first heartbreak at 17 with a pros and cons list, who had selected his MBA concentration using a weighted decision matrix that he'd shown me with genuine pride. He was analytical and thorough and relentlessly methodical, and he had inherited every one of those qualities from me. And sitting across the kitchen island, watching him map DNA matches into a family tree, I felt a complicated surge of love and dread. "There are 47 matches," he said without looking up. "Some are distant, but there's a bunch of second and third cousins. I've been looking at the family names, and they're mostly Chen, obviously. But there are some Wongs and some Lees that connect through marriages." He finally looked up at me, his face open and bright with curiosity. "Did you know you had such a big extended family? Is this the side you don't talk about?" "Something like that," I said, pouring my coffee with a steady hand. Sarah touched my arm as she passed. That touch, light, knowing, a small act of solidarity, was the language of our marriage, the compressed vocabulary of two people who had learned each other's silences. She knew this was delicate territory. She did not push. Marcus, however, was in full research mode, and research mode in my son is not easily redirected. He tilted the laptop screen so I could see it. A color-coded spreadsheet with columns for match name, relationship estimate, shared centimorgans, and a final column labeled notes where he had already begun entering observations. James M. was at the top of the close family matches, highlighted in orange. I looked at that orange cell and felt the same compression in my chest I'd felt the previous night. "This James person," Marcus said, tapping the screen, "he's your first cousin. That means your father and his father were siblings, right? So his dad would be your uncle." "Correct," I said. "Have you ever met him?" I took a sip of coffee. The coffee was good, freshly ground, the Ethiopian blend that Sarah had been buying for years. I noted the taste the way you note things when you're aware that your attention is managing several things at once. "A long time ago," I said, "when I was young. But you lost touch?" "We did." Marcus looked at me for a moment with the patient, open expression of someone waiting for the story to continue. When it did not, he returned to his spreadsheet with the pragmatic acceptance of a person who has learned that sometimes data collection has to proceed without full context. "I'm going to send him a message," he announced. "Just a polite introduction. DNA matches expect people to reach out." "Give me a few days first," I said. "I want to review the matches myself before we start making contact." Marcus paused in his typing and looked up at me again. A different look this time. The one he used when he suspected my reasoning had an unstated component. He was 23, and he had my own capacity for reading the subtext beneath a stated position, which meant that lying to him, or even significantly eliding the truth, required a level of technical precision I found increasingly uncomfortable to deploy. "Sure," he said finally, and returned to his screen. Sarah put a plate of toast in front of me and met my eyes for precisely long enough to communicate, with the wordless fluency of 19 years, that she was not going to pretend this was an ordinary morning, and that she was going to wait for me to explain myself on my own timetable, and that the timetable should not be allowed to run indefinitely. That, I thought, eating my toast with a steady hand, was fair. But Marcus was 23 and possessed of my own stubborn analytical drive, and over the following 2 weeks I watched him move through those 47 matches with the systematic patience of a researcher. He sent polite, enthusiastic messages to third cousins asking about family history. He requested access to family trees on the genealogy site. He cross-referenced last names against publicly available records. He built a family map on a whiteboard in his apartment. I know this because Emma told me during a phone call, laughing about how Marcus had turned a DNA test into a dissertation project. And I laughed too because the alternative was something I wasn't ready for yet. And I watched. I am ashamed of this now, but I watched without intervening. I told myself it was because I needed time to think, to plan the right approach, to figure out the least damaging way to introduce 28 years of concealment to the people I loved most. But there was something else underneath that, something I am only able to name because enough time has passed and enough truth has been spoken that I no longer have the luxury of flattering myself. I was afraid. A man can build composure into his bones and still be afraid. They are not mutually exclusive. There was a moment in the first week that I should describe specifically, because it is the moment that should have been the moment and wasn't, and I think honesty requires me to account for that. It was a Wednesday evening. Marcus was at the kitchen island again, this time with printed sheets spread out in front of him. Actual paper, because he was the kind of person who sometimes needed to lay things out physically in order to see the pattern. I came in from my office, and he looked up and said, with the casual precision of someone fitting a piece into a puzzle, "Dad, did you know the family used to run a restaurant business, like a chain? There are business records going back to the early 80s, 3 locations in the Greater Vancouver area." He held up a printed page. I could see it was a scan of something, an old document with typed text. I found a digitized Chamber of Commerce registration from 1982, Chen Family Restaurant Partnership. He looked at me. "Is this your dad's business?" I stood at the edge of the kitchen and I looked at my son holding a document that described the thing I had walked away from, and I thought clearly and specifically, now, this is the moment. Tell him now. "Yes," I said, "that was his business." "That's incredible." Marcus looked back at the document. "What happened to it?" "It grew," I said. And then, before the next question could arrive, "I have to make a call. Can we talk about this later?" I went back into my office and closed the door, and sat at my desk and stared at the scratch on the right edge of the mahogany, and thought about the specific flavor of cowardice involved in what I had just done. Not dramatic cowardice, not the kind of refusal that carries any dignity. The quiet, mundane kind that "can we talk about this later" that depends for its function on the other person's decency and good manners and willingness not to push through a door that has been half closed in their face. Marcus was decent and well-mannered. He did not push. That night, I sat at the kitchen table after Sarah had gone to bed and thought about things I would not learn until the reunion in Vancouver, about my father attending University of Calgary convocations on the chance of seeing grandchildren he did not know. I did not have the specific knowledge yet, but the weight of the unknown pressed on me with a force that was almost its own form of knowing, that somewhere in the distance between Calgary and Vancouver, things had continued in my absence that I had convinced myself had simply stopped. I watched Marcus discover that his paternal grandfather had been one of 9 children. I watched him learn that there were Chens scattered all across Western Canada, many of them connected to restaurant businesses that I recognized immediately, places I had deliberately never patronized in 28 years, companies whose names I had steered clients away from in casual conversation without ever explaining why. I watched my son discover the edges of a story he didn't yet know was about his own father. And I kept my hands steady and my voice level and my face composed, and I told myself there would be a right moment. There was not a right moment. There was only the moment that arrived, the way moments always do, on its own schedule and without regard for your readiness. 2 weeks after the initial text, Marcus came to find me in my home office. It was a Saturday afternoon, grey with the particular flat light of a Calgary November, the kind of day that flattens everything into a uniform quiet. He leaned in the doorway with his phone in his hand, and something new in his expression. Not quite suspicion, not quite accusation, but a kind of careful watchfulness that I recognized because I had worn it myself at 23, when I started understanding that the world was more complicated than I'd been told. "Dad, I've been talking to a third cousin named Patricia. She's really into genealogy, like seriously into it. She has subscription accounts on 4 different sites." A pause. "She asked about you, specifically when I mentioned my last name and that we're in Calgary." He held out his phone. I took it. The message from Patricia read, "Is your father's name David? There was a David Chen who disappeared from the family in the late 90s. We always wondered what happened to him." The words on that small screen were so ordinary, plain sentences, simply constructed, and yet reading them felt like watching a door swing open onto a room I had locked from the outside and then spent 28 years trying to forget was there. "What did you tell her?" I asked. My voice was what it always was. "I said I'd ask you about it." Marcus straightened. He had his mother's directness when something mattered to him. "Dad, did you disappear from your family?" Sarah had gone very still at the kitchen table. The sound of her tea mug being set down was careful and deliberate, the sound of someone choosing not to create noise. I stood at my desk, with my son's phone in my hand, and I thought, this is the moment where I could choose one more time the direction I had always chosen. I could say it was complicated. I could say we'd talk about it when I had more time, when the work pressure eased, when the right words arranged themselves into the right order. Marcus was respectful and well-raised, and he would not push past a closed door if I signaled clearly enough that the door was closed. But I could see the whiteboard in his apartment with the family tree on it. I could see 47 matches on a DNA database, including a first cousin who lived in Vancouver and who had apparently not changed his name and who was, by the evidence of the matching database, actively engaged with his family history. I could see the timeline converging with the remorseless logic of a due diligence process I would have recognized instantly in any professional context. And I understood something I had been choosing not to understand. This was not a question of if anymore. The arithmetic of DNA and genealogy databases and a son who built spreadsheets was inexorable. I set Marcus's phone on the desk. I did not set it down carelessly or dramatically. I set it with the specific deliberateness of someone who is about to say something that cannot be unsaid and wants to be present for it. "There's a family gathering," I said quietly, because something had already shifted in me, and the only direction was through. Patricia mentioned it in a message I saw over Marcus's shoulder when he was showing me his matches. "A reunion in Vancouver next month for your great-aunt's 90th birthday." Marcus straightened. "Yeah, she invited me. I was going to ask if we could go." He looked at me with the kind of careful hope that only young people can sustain in the face of ambiguity. "I've never met any of these people. They haven't invited me," I said. "Well, obviously they don't know you're my dad yet. But once they do, Marcus." I turned to face him fully, and for the first time in 28 years, I let my face show something that was not composed. They know exactly who I am. They have always known where I am. And they have not invited me in 28 years. The silence in the kitchen was absolute, the kind of silence that has physical weight, that you can feel pressing against your eardrums. Sarah spoke first, her voice careful, as hands handling something that might break. "David, maybe it's time." Maybe it was time. We booked the flights on a Sunday. 4 seats, 2 rows, Calgary to Vancouver. Depart at 6:40 in the morning to arrive with enough time before the afternoon event. Emma had flown in from Montreal the previous Thursday, already jet-lagged from a run of back-to-back shifts, and she sat at our kitchen table on the evening we booked and listened to the compressed version of the story that Sarah and Marcus between them had assembled. The DNA matches, the Patricia message, the 28 years, the distance, with the careful whole-picture attention she brought to complicated diagnoses, asking clarifying questions that were precise without being cruel. "So, you've never talked about any of this in my entire life," she said, not as an accusation, but as the clear-eyed statement of a fact she was adding to her working model. "No." She looked at me for a moment. "Okay." And then, "What do you need from us when we're there?" That question, "What do you need from us?" was one of the most specifically adult things I had ever heard my daughter say. I had needed things from my children before, but they had always guessed them, or Sarah had quietly communicated them, or the need had been ambient enough that no one required specific instructions. But Emma, in the particular maturity of someone who has spent years in hospital environments, learning to ask the right question directly and accept the actual answer, was asking me to name it. "I need you to meet them," I said. "That's what this is really about. Not about me. I need my children to know the people who are their family." Emma nodded once. The decisiveness of someone who has taken a position and will hold it. The flight to Vancouver is 1 hour and 15 minutes from Calgary International. I know this because I had made calculations about it periodically over 28 years. Not with any serious intention of going, but the way your mind performs certain calculations involuntarily. Like checking the distance to a door in a building even when you're not planning to leave. I had imagined the approach to Vancouver dozens of times. The mountains materializing through the plane window, the sprawl of the city below, the particular quality of coastal light that is nothing like the prairie light I had replaced it with. I almost didn't go. The morning of, I sat at the edge of our bed in the Mount Royal house for 40 minutes, while Sarah moved around, getting ready, and I tracked her movements in my peripheral vision with the vigilance of someone waiting for a verdict. She did not give me a speech. She did not tell me what to do. She packed her own small carry-on with efficient movements, and then she stood in front of me and put both hands on my face and looked at me. And what she communicated in that look was everything a marriage of 19 years can compress into a single moment of contact. "I know you, I see you, I'm not going anywhere. Now get up." I got up. On the plane, I sat next to Marcus, while Sarah took the row ahead of us and Emma the window seat across the aisle. Marcus had, predictably, spent the previous week preparing for the reunion with the thoroughness he brought to consequential events. He had read about the history of the restaurant business, about which cousins had been involved and when, about the Vancouver neighborhood where the first location had opened. He had printed photographs from the genealogy site, family pictures spanning 4 decades, and organized them in a folder that he carried on the plane with the care you give something fragile. He did not show me the folder on the plane. He seemed to understand, with the intuition he had developed over 23 years of reading me, that there was a threshold of preparation I had reached and that pushing further was not helpful. He talked about other things instead. His MBA coursework, a consulting project he was wrapping up, the latest episode of a podcast we both listened to. Normal conversation. Calibrated with the specific warmth of someone who is giving a person they love a respite from the thing that is coming. I was grateful for it in a way that was difficult to express, and so I did not try to express it, which is the kind of silence that fathers and sons have together and which carries its own form of communication. The hotel ballroom in Vancouver was decorated in red and gold for a woman turning 90, and the moment I walked through the door, it was 1997 again. Not because anything looked the same, because nothing did, but because the particular convergence of Chinese-Canadian family gathering energy hit me in the chest, like a physical force. The smell of food being prepared somewhere nearby. The sound of 3 generations talking simultaneously in English and Cantonese, and the mixture of both that feels like home, if home is a word you're still allowed to use for the place you came from. Children running between adult legs. Someone's grandmother stationed near the entrance in a chair that had been clearly brought from home because hotel chairs weren't right. I stood just inside the doorway for a moment, and I felt, in that moment, something I had not expected. Not dread, or not only dread. Something older and more complicated. The recognition that comes from encountering something you thought you had left behind, and discovering that it has been present in you the entire time, encoded in senses and reflexes that don't know about your clean break. The smell of that particular combination of cooking oil and chrysanthemums and pressed clothing and children's shampoo was not a smell from my present life in Calgary. It was a smell from before I was David Chen of North Point Capital, and it was, despite everything, immediately familiar. Marcus was looking around with the alert, organized intensity of a researcher arriving at a field site. He had the folder under his arm and his phone out with the genealogy app ready. Emma was scanning the room with her physician's systematic assessment, taking in faces and ages and the spatial organization of the crowd. Sarah was next to me, her hand finding mine briefly and then releasing, the touch that said I am here, and then stepped back to give me whatever space I needed. I recognized people immediately. The cousins who had been in their 30s when I left were now in their 60s, different in body but recognizable in the architecture of their faces. There were younger people I had never met, children born after I disappeared, who carried family resemblances I knew without knowing them. A young woman near the dessert table had my mother's way of standing, the weight slightly on the left hip, one hand resting on the table, the posture of someone who is comfortable taking up space without making a display of it. And I had to look away from her, because seeing a stranger inhabit a gesture from your childhood does something to your chest that requires a moment to absorb. And near the entrance, speaking with a group of teenagers, was a man I would have known anywhere. James stood with his teenage son, and even across 30 feet of ballroom I could read his body language with the fluency of someone who had grown up in the same house. He was heavier than I remembered, grey at the temples. The particular set of his jaw that I had known since we were children was still there, recognizable as a family heirloom. He spotted me before I had taken 3 steps past the door. His face moved through several expressions in rapid succession, so quickly that only someone watching specifically for it would have caught them all. Shock first, genuine and unguarded, then anger, hot and immediate. The kind that comes not from fresh grievance, but from the rekindling of old embers. Then something cooler and more calculated, the professional assessment of a man who had spent 28 years running a business. And finally, underneath all of that, something harder to name, a murkiness that might have been grief or might have been relief or might have been both simultaneously, because grief and relief are not always the opposites we pretend they are. Marcus, who had been walking beside me and taking in the room with wide, eager eyes, had no access to any of this subtext. He saw a man who matched a DNA profile, a cousin he had never met, and he walked directly toward him with the straightforward momentum of someone who had been looking forward to this meeting for weeks. "Are you James? I'm Marcus. We matched on 23andMe. He put out his hand, grinning. James looked at my son, his cousin, whom he was meeting for the first time because I had been absent for the entirety of this young man's existence, and he managed a smile that was not entirely manufactured. There was something real in it, some involuntary response to Marcus's genuine warmth that James could not quite suppress. "Yeah," he said, "I figured we'd meet here." And then his eyes cut to me over Marcus's shoulder, direct and hard. "Hello, David. It's been a while." 28 years, I said, "but who's counting?" His voice carried an edge that Marcus heard. I watched my son's expression change. The bright anticipation shifting into something more careful, the spreadsheet mind beginning to process a data set that didn't fit the expected pattern. He looked between James and me, and I could see the recalculation happening. We were saved from the immediate awkward silence by the event coordinator calling everyone to attention for the first round of toasts, announcing that dinner would begin in 15 minutes and asking families to find their assigned tables. The crowd rearranged itself. I took Sarah's hand and found our seats with Marcus and Emma, who had flown in from Montreal and was still slightly jet-lagged, her medical resident's ability to function on insufficient sleep only partially compensating, and we settled at a table near the center of the room. The toasts were warm and funny and occasionally tearful, as toasts at 90th birthday parties tend to be, full of the particular emotional texture of occasions that everyone knows might be among the last of their kind. My great-aunt sat at the head table in her wheelchair with the bearing of a woman who has earned the right to take up exactly as much space as she wants, and she received each toast with the measured appreciation of someone who has heard many tributes and knows the difference between the genuine and the performed. I watched her watching the room. Her eyes, behind small wire-framed glasses, missed nothing. There was one moment during the toasts that I want to preserve specifically. A woman who introduced herself as my great-aunt's youngest daughter stood and spoke for about 4 minutes about her mother's immigration to Canada in 1952, about arriving with $40 and a cousin's address written in pencil on a folded piece of paper, about the specific quality of determination that her mother had carried from that arrival all the way through 90 years of building, failing, rebuilding, and continuing. She talked about the restaurant her parents had opened, not the Chen family restaurant I had worked in, but an earlier one, before my time, a small counter-service lunch spot that had lasted 11 years and had served, she said, as the foundation for everything that came afterward. Every subsequent business, every subsequent generation's confidence in their own capacity to build something, all of it, she argued, traced back to those 11 years and those original $40. I sat at my table and listened to this and felt something shift in my understanding of my own history. I'd always thought of the family business that my father and uncle built as a beginning, the origin story of the Chens in the restaurant trade. But what this woman was describing was a continuation, a thread that had been running for longer than I knew, passed from her parents to my father's generation like a baton. The $85,000 I had taken when I left was, in some sense, a portion of that thread, which meant the story I'd been telling myself, that I had simply sold my share of a failing business at a fair price and moved on, was incomplete in ways I had been choosing not to examine. Dinner was served. I sat at a round table with James, 2 second cousins named Helen and Robert, and their spouses. The conversation began in the careful and polite register of people who have agreed implicitly to keep things civil. Questions about jobs and children and where people were living now, the conversational equivalent of shuffling around the perimeter of a room without going near the center. Sarah steered the conversation with the social fluency that had made her invaluable at every business dinner we'd attended together, and for a while I thought we might get through the meal without the thing I could feel building. Helen was a woman in her early 60s, with her mother's quick laugh and an educator's habit of asking questions, and then genuinely listening to the answers. She had been teaching high school history for 35 years, she told us, and was now in her final year before retirement. And she spoke about it with the mix of anticipation and melancholy that characterizes the end of a vocation rather than just a job. Robert had worked in municipal planning in Surrey for decades and had the particular combination of idealism and pragmatism that long careers in public service either develop or destroy. Both of them were warm and curious and apparently unaware of the specific charge that was building in the conversation between James and me, which was the great advantage of being a more distant relation. They were guests at a gathering, not parties to an old dispute. Then Helen said it, brightly, with the innocent good intentions of someone who genuinely did not know the charge she was walking into. "So, David, Marcus says you're in private equity. That must be quite different from the family businesses." "Very different," I agreed. "The restaurant group is up to 17 locations now." James's voice was conversational in its surface texture and hard as compressed steel beneath it. He was looking at me the way people look at someone they've been rehearsing a conversation with for years. "No thanks to you, of course. When you disappeared, Dad had to buy out your share at a terrible time. Nearly bankrupted us." Marcus set down his fork. The small, careful sound of it was loud in the space that had opened up around our table as the conversation at neighboring tables began to notice the quality of what was happening at ours. "Dad had a share in a restaurant business?" Marcus asked, and I could hear in his voice the specific tone of a person who is beginning to understand that the map they've been using doesn't match the territory. "He had a 30% share." James kept his eyes on me. "Our fathers started the business together. Then David decided he wanted something different and sold his shares for $85,000 in 1998, right before we landed the contract that made the business worth millions. The number sat in the air of the room. $85,000. I watched Marcus and Emma absorbing it, calculating what James was implying, that I had walked away from what would have been, within 3 years, approximately $4.2 million. Emma set her own fork down. She did it with more control than Marcus had, the clinical precision of someone managing a reaction. But I saw the specific stillness that meant she was processing something significant. She looked at James for a moment, and then at me with the steady gaze she used when she was deciding whether to ask the next question or wait for more information. "I didn't know about the contract," I said. My voice was level. I had spent 28 years building that levelness, and I used it now. "You didn't ask." James leaned back slightly in his chair. The gesture was controlled, but I could read the architecture of it, a man taking up space because he's been waiting a very long time for the room to let him. "You just said you needed out, needed a fresh start, needed to find yourself, or whatever the appropriate phrase was in 1998. And then you changed your name, moved to Calgary, and never looked back." Emma was staring at me. Marcus was staring at me. Sarah's hand found mine under the tablecloth, and I felt her fingers close around mine with the quiet steadiness she had offered me for 19 years. "That's not entirely accurate," I said. "No." James's eyebrows rose. "Please, enlighten us. Enlighten your kids, since we're all here. Tell us why they've never met their grandfather's side of the family. Why they had to learn about us from a DNA test instead of Christmas cards. Why we had to read about David Chen of North Point Capital in business magazines and realize 7 years ago from a photograph that you'd been 40 minutes away by plane for most of your adult life." The table was silent. People at neighboring tables were not pretending not to listen anymore. Something happened to me in that moment that I want to describe accurately because it matters. It was not anger, though anger was part of it. It was not shame, though shame was present too. What it was, most precisely, was the sensation of a 28-year-old wall reaching its structural limit, the feeling you get in a building when the load-bearing element finally encounters the force it was built to resist, and something in the foundation accepts that the reckoning is here. I stood up, not dramatically, deliberately, the way I stand up in boardrooms when something important needs to be said, and I am the person who has to say it. When I spoke, my voice carried in the way it always carries when I mean every word. In 1997, the family business was struggling. My father and my uncle had started the first restaurant in 1982 with everything they had, their savings, their borrowed money, their belief that they could build something, and for a long time they did. But by 1996, they were fighting constantly about money, about direction, about the future of the business. The restaurants were losing accounts, losing staff. The kitchen equipment in the second location was failing, and they couldn't agree on whether to repair or replace it. My father wanted to hold steady and wait for the market to shift. My uncle wanted to modernize aggressively. I paused, letting the room feel the weight of what I was describing. James was 28 and trying to bring the business into the current decade, and my father was pushing back on every change, and I was 24 years old. Caught in the exact middle of two men I loved who had stopped being able to hear each other. I looked at James directly. You came to find me at the second location one afternoon in October. I was doing inventory in the back. The business had just lost a catering contract we'd been counting on, and I remember the smell of the walk-in cooler and the sound of the prep cook working in the kitchen. Because fear has a way of burning sensory details into your memory. You told me I wasn't contributing enough. You told me that my approach to the business problems was too passive, that I wasn't fighting for anything, that I was dead weight. I held his gaze. And then you said I should do everyone a favor and disappear because I was contributing nothing anyway. James's face changed, not dramatically, but the hard angles shifted like a building settling. You said it the way people say things when they're exhausted and frightened and running out of patience, I continued, because accuracy matters and because I was done being less than accurate. I don't think you meant for it to be permanent. I don't think you imagined that a 24-year-old who already felt like a failure would take those words and use them as permission to vanish. But I was 24, and I took them at exactly face value. I looked around the table, around the room. There were 60, 70 people within earshot, spanning 4 generations of my family, many of them strangers to me by now, all of them connected to me by blood and history and the invisible threads of shared origin. I sold my shares for what they were worth at the time, I said. The business was 3 months from bankruptcy when I left. $85,000 was a fair price for 30% of a company that was hemorrhaging money. I didn't know about the contract that came 6 months later. I didn't know the business would recover. I knew only that I was 24 years old, and the people I'd grown up loving had made it clear I had no place among them. My voice held. I had spent 28 years building a voice that holds. I took that $85,000 and I moved to Calgary and I changed my name because I needed the psychological clean break of being someone new in a place where nobody knew the old someone. And I built a life. It took every dollar I had and 10 years of working harder than I had believed I was capable of working, but I built something. I married an extraordinary woman. I raised 2 children who are standing in this room right now and who are brilliant and principled and kind and who deserve to know this story before tonight, which is a failure I own completely and will spend time making right. I looked at Emma and Marcus. I raised them to ask hard questions and to tell difficult truths, and I did not model that in the way I should have, and I am sorry. I paused. The room was absolutely still, but I also want to say this clearly because I spent 28 years carrying a story I'd only ever heard one version of. I did not reach out because nobody reached out. Not in 28 years. Not an email, not a letter, not a phone call to the number that has been publicly listed under a variation of my real name for over 2 decades. I'm not asking for that to be different than it was. I understand why. Pride is a weight that everyone carries. But I want my children to know the full shape of this story, not just the part where their father walked away. I looked at James one last time. I'm not here to collect a debt or assign blame. I'm here because my son built a family tree from a DNA test and earned the right to know the people in it. That's all." I sat down. The silence lasted long enough to feel like a third presence in the room. Marcus was very still beside me. I could see his hands on the table, fingers slightly spread, the posture of someone who is grounding themselves physically because the emotional intake is large. Emma, across the table, was watching me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not the physician's assessment, not the daughter's familiar warmth, but something open and rearranged, like a room that has had all its furniture moved and is being seen clearly for the first time. She did not speak, but she reached across the table and put her hand over mine where it rested on the tablecloth, and she left it there. Sarah, on my other side, exhaled a breath so quiet I felt more than heard it. She did not say anything either. The three of them formed a silent perimeter around me in the immediate aftermath of what I had said, and that perimeter was worth more than any amount of speech. And then, from the head table, I heard my great-aunt's voice, reedy in the way of voices that have lasted 90 years, but carrying the precision of a woman who has spent a lifetime making sure she was heard. "David Chen, come here. You do not disobey a woman who is 90 years old at her own party." The crowd parted as I walked to the head table, and I was aware of Marcus and Emma falling in behind me like a small, uncertain procession, and of James watching from his seat with an expression I could not fully read. My great-aunt looked up at me from her wheelchair with eyes that had the quality of very still water, clear, deep, and missing nothing. She was small and spare in the way of very old people who have reduced themselves to pure essence, wearing a red silk blouse that I suspected had been bought specifically for this occasion. 28 years, she said, and you still look like your mother." My chest compressed. My mother had been a small woman with quick eyes and careful hands, and she had died of cancer before I'd built enough of this new life to feel safe enough to tell her about it. And that specific failure was one I'd carried so long it had become structural. Less like a wound, and more like a load-bearing wall. "She'd be 68 now," my great-aunt continued, "if the cancer hadn't taken her." "I know," I said quietly. "She asked about you. At the end. Wanted to know if you were happy wherever you'd gone." The floor beneath me felt briefly unreliable. "I am," I said, because it was true, and because it was the only thing available. My great-aunt was silent for a moment, her hands folded in her lap, with the controlled stillness of someone who has learned to conserve energy for the things that matter. Then she said something that surprised me. "Your mother was a practical woman. She did not waste time on what couldn't be changed, but she kept a drawer in the kitchen where she used to keep recipes, and by the end it had your business articles in it, the ones from the Calgary magazines, the TED Talk transcript printed out." She paused. "She watched the talk 3 times that I know of." I was not expecting that. I stood at the head table of my great-aunt's 90th birthday party, surrounded by 60 members of a family I had absented myself from for 28 years, and the information that my mother had read my business articles and watched my TED Talk arrived in me with the force of something that has been held at a distance for too long and has finally reached you. "Did she tell anyone about it?" I asked. "She told me," my great-aunt said, "and she told your father near the end. She showed him the talk. They watched it together." A pause. He didn't speak for a long time afterward. Then he said, "He sounds like his grandfather, the way he talks. His grandfather could clear a room like that." She looked at me steadily. "His grandfather was your father's father, a man who came to this country with nothing and made something the same way you did, different circumstances, same result." The compression in my chest deepened. I didn't know he knew. He knew. He was proud of you, in the difficult way that proud, stubborn men are proud of people they can't reach, which is a way of being proud that feels, from the outside, like indifference. But it wasn't. She shook her head very slightly. He and your mother were not easy people to know, but they were not indifferent. Good. She looked past me at Marcus and Emma, who had stopped a few feet back. These are your children. I stepped aside. Marcus, Emma. My great-aunt studied them with the same unhurried thoroughness she'd been applying to everything in the room all evening. The assessment of someone who has seen enough iterations of humanity to know what she's looking at. Good faces, she said finally. Smart ones, I can always tell. She looked at Marcus specifically. You sent the messages? The genealogy questions? Marcus blinked. Yes. Mom. Good instincts. She settled back in her chair and turned her gaze to James, who had come to stand at the edge of the small circle that had formed around the head table. Her voice, when she addressed him, had a different quality, not unkind, but without any of the gentleness she'd used with me. You've been giving him a hard time tonight. We were just talking, James said. The syllable carried significant skepticism. Your father was the same. Spoke his grievances out loud and then called it talking. She shook her head slightly. Your uncle, David's father, he regretted it, you know. The fighting, the way things ended. He told me so more than once. She looked at me. He died 5 years ago. I imagine James didn't pass that along. The floor tilted again. I had known intellectually that my father was likely gone. He would have been 81, and I had done the private calculations late at night over the years. But knowing something intellectually and being told it in a hotel ballroom surrounded by your family is the difference between reading about a storm and standing in it. No, I managed. He didn't mention it. Stubborn man. Your father wanted to reach out but told himself you'd chosen your life and he'd respect it. Kept a photograph of you from a business article, one of those profiles they do in the financial magazines. Kept it in his wallet. She shook her head again, and in that small gesture I could see the entire shape of the tragedy. Two proud people waiting for the other to move first, both of them waiting until time ran out. He was stubborn, and so were you. And between you wasted 30 years. The word wasted landed in my chest and stayed there. But you're here now, she said, and her voice shifted slightly, losing the edge of verdict and moving into something more like the territory of old, tired grace. That's something. At 90, you learn to take what's something. She reached out her hand. It was spotted with age, and the ring on her fourth finger was loose with the weight she'd lost over the years, but her grip, when I took her hand, was steady. Stay, she said. Eat. Let your children meet their family. You've been a stranger long enough. What happened over the next 4 hours is something I find genuinely difficult to summarize, not because nothing happened, a great deal happened, but because the things that happened were not the kind that compress well into narrative. They were quiet, cumulative, the way the tide comes in. Marcus moved through the room with his characteristic methodical warmth, collecting names and faces and stories, matching people to cells in his mental spreadsheet, and seeming to derive a satisfaction from each connection that was entirely genuine and entirely his own. Emma, who is by nature quieter and more observational, found herself at a table with 3 older women who knew the history of our family going back to the generation that had immigrated, and I watched my daughter listen with the quality of attention she brings to everything she cares about, the physician's concentration. I met a cousin named Winston, who was 73 years old and had worked in the original restaurant alongside my father in the 80s, who remembered my father as a man who checked the books every Tuesday morning with the same expression he might use to check a weather forecast. Interested but resigned, accepting what he found because the alternative was not accepting it, and that was not an option. Winston had the particular humor of someone who has survived enough disappointments to be able to describe them with lightness. And he told me stories about my father that I had never heard, small, specific stories, the kind that don't make it into official family memory, but that carry, in their specificity, more truth than any summary. He told me that my father, late in his life, had taken up watercolor painting, which I could not have predicted in any calculation I might have made about the man I remembered. He described my father painting at a folding table in his kitchen in retirement, painting landscapes of places he had never been, imagining coastlines and mountains he had only read about. He was good at it, Winston said. Better than he thought he was. That was always his problem, actually. Better than he thought he was. I met Marcus's third cousin Patricia, who was exactly what I had expected from someone who maintained subscription accounts on 4 genealogy sites, thorough, organized, and possessed of the missionary's conviction that the past deserved to be known in full detail. She had a tablet and a laptop and a portable scanner and a binder of printed documents. And she spent 20 minutes showing me the family tree she had built, 6 generations of Chens, documented with the diligence of someone who believes that every name deserves to be preserved. She had records I had never seen, my grandparents' immigration documents from 1923, photographs of the family in their first Canadian home, business licenses and partnership agreements going back through 4 decades of the restaurant trade. She handled all of it with the same careful reverence, which I found moving in a way I hadn't expected from someone I had only just met. "Your son is wonderful," she said at some point during this. "The way he asks questions, you can tell he actually wants to know." "He does," I said. "That's him always." "It's a gift," she said. "Not everyone wants to know." I thought about that for a moment. "No," I agreed. "Not everyone does." I met cousins I had never known. I saw photographs of my parents that I had never seen. My mother at 30, my father at 26, both of them impossibly young, standing in front of the first restaurant location with the expressions of people who have bet everything on something and are still waiting to find out whether they were right. I learned that my father had, in the last decade of his life, attended every University of Calgary convocation ceremony that was publicly announced on the chance that his grandchildren might be among the graduates. I learned this from a cousin who had gone with him twice, who told me this casually as context and then watched my face change and had the kindness not to comment on it. I stood in a corner of the ballroom with that knowledge, and I let it settle into me without trying to organize or process it. My father had taken the train to Calgary on convocation days and sat in a large hall and scanned rows of graduating faces for one that might look like his son's. He had not known Marcus's name or Emma's face. He had simply gone and sat and looked and then gone home. And he had told himself, I supposed, that this was respecting my choice to be separate, which was one of the many names that proud people use for not being able to move first. I had told myself for 28 years that the silence was mutual, symmetrical, that my absence was, if not welcomed, then at least accepted, that the family I had left had reorganized around my absence the way water reorganizes around a removed stone, completely, without remainder. But standing in that ballroom, holding this new information, I began to understand that I had constructed that story partly because I needed it. The alternative, that they had been looking in their way, and I had been looking in my way, and we had all been looking in directions that guaranteed we would not find each other, was harder to hold. The reckoning of that understanding arrived not as grief exactly, but as a kind of settling, the acknowledgement of a ledger that would never fully balance. James found me near the end of the evening, when the younger children had gone home, and the remaining crowd had softened into the relaxed, reflective quality of celebrations winding down. He came to stand beside me at the edge of the room, and we both looked at Marcus across the space, laughing with a group of second cousins his age about something on someone's phone. "I did say that." James's voice was lower than it had been at dinner. The hard architecture was still there. "It doesn't dissolve in one night, 28 years of accumulated position." But something underneath it had shifted. The thing I said about disappearing. "I know. I was 28 and the business was dying, and I thought everyone needed to be accountable, and you seemed—" He paused. "You seemed like you'd already given up, like you were waiting for permission to leave." "Maybe I was," I said. "I was 24 and I didn't know how to fight for something that felt like it was already falling apart. That's on me." "Oh, but I gave you the permission you were looking for." "Yes, and you took it literally." "Yes." James was quiet for a moment. Across the room, Marcus had made someone laugh at something, and the sound of it reached us clearly. "I didn't know you had kids," James said. "We figured out you were in Calgary about 7 years ago. One of the business magazines ran a profile. But we'd been trying to find you before that, for the first few years. Then we assumed you wanted to be left alone." Something in me paused. "You tried to find me?" "For 3, maybe 4 years after you left. Then the business took off and we got busy and—" He stopped. "That sounds like an excuse." "It is an excuse," I said without cruelty, "but it's also just what happens. You could have reached out, once you made it, once it was clear you were doing well." "You're right. You're the one who left. You're right about that too." We stood in the specific silence of 2 men who have acknowledged their respective portions of a complicated failure and arrived at the place where there is nothing left to argue about, only the question of what comes next. James looked at Marcus again, still across the room, still laughing. There was something in his expression that I recognized. The complicated mixture of affection and grief that you feel when you see something you've missed, that you understand now you have missed, and that you cannot fully recover even by standing next to it. He had missed 23 years of Marcus. He had missed Emma's entire life. Those absences were real and could not be compressed into the evening's accounting. "I'm sorry about your father," he said after a while, "for not telling you. Thank you. He would have wanted to know about them." James nodded toward Marcus and Emma. "He asked about you sometimes, late on, whether anyone had heard anything. And had they?" "No, not until the magazine piece 7 years ago." He turned slightly to look at me. I thought about reaching out then. When I saw the photograph, I had the email address the magazine listed for the firm. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because I wasn't sure what I would say, and because I was still angry, if I'm honest, and because—" He stopped. "Because reaching out first would have meant admitting that I cared whether you were there or not, and I'd spent 28 years telling myself I didn't." The honesty of that landed cleanly between us, without drama. It was the kind of statement that 2 men can make at the end of a long evening when the pretenses have been worn down to the truth underneath. And there is something almost comfortable about it, the particular relief of no longer needing to perform indifference. "My kids deserve to know their family," I said finally. "That's the only thing I know how to say with certainty tonight. I'm not asking for the past back. I'm not asking for the years we lost to be somehow unlost. But Marcus and Emma deserve the full story. The family history, the photographs, the immigration records. The real thing, not just the DNA results." James considered. "Patricia's the one for that, the genealogy." He almost smiled. "She's built the whole tree, going back 6 generations. She's got immigration documents, business records, photographs of the first restaurant. She'd love nothing more than to share it. I'd appreciate that. And—" James stopped, started again. "My son is thinking about engineering. University of Calgary is on his list. It's a good program. Marcus could show him around, if he applied. He'd be glad to. I looked at James. I know this isn't forgiveness. I know it's not reconciliation in any clean sense, but it's a start, James said. Maybe, I agreed. On the flight back to Calgary, the city lights of Vancouver receded below the plane window, and the dark mountains appeared, and then the endless illuminated grid of the prairies, familiar and vast and mine in the way that things become yours when you have chosen them deliberately over many years. Emma was asleep across the aisle, her head against the window, looking younger than 26 in the way sleeping adults always do. Marcus was next to me, awake, looking at the dark outside without the spreadsheet expression, just looking, the way you look when you are processing something too large for categories. Sarah had taken the row ahead of us, claiming she wanted to read in peace, which was her thoughtful way of giving our son and me the space she understood we needed. "You were going to let me just keep digging," Marcus said finally. "You weren't going to stop me." "No. Why?" I thought about the honest answer which I owed him, which I had owed him for years, because some truths come out regardless, I said. "I've watched enough people in business try to build walls around things that wanted to come out, and I've watched what happens when those walls cost more to maintain than the thing behind them is worth. I've seen how big the damage gets when it finally arrives anyway." I paused, and maybe also because I needed someone else to start the opening before I could walk through it, which isn't something I'm proud of. Marcus considered this with the same careful attention he brought to balance sheets. "You always tell me that delayed problems compound." "Yes." "You waited 28 years." "Yes. That's a lot of compounding." "It is." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere below us in the dark, the foothills of Alberta were passing. "The thing James said to you, the disappearing thing, it really hurt that much." I thought about what it had felt like to be 24 years old and frightened and convinced I was failing, and to have someone I admired say the words that confirmed everything I already feared about myself. I thought about the particular cruelty of confirmation, how much worse it is than accusation. How accusation you can argue against, but confirmation of your own worst self-assessment sits in you differently. "Yes," I said, "it really did. I'm sorry. Not your fault. But still, I agreed. He leaned his head back against the headrest and looked at the ceiling of the plane. "Great Aunt Helen. She's something. She always has been. She told James off in front of 70 people and made it look like she was doing him a favor." He almost smiled. "I want to be like that at 90. You've got time. Are you going to stay in touch with them? With James?" "I think so. Carefully. We'll figure out what it can be." I looked at my son. "Are you okay with all of it?" He turned his head to look at me, and in the particular light of a plane cabin at night, he looked very young, and also somehow older than he had been that morning. The look of someone who has absorbed something important and is integrating it into their understanding of the world. "I got a whole extended family out of a DNA test," he said. "Found out my dad used to have a different name and walked away from what would have been millions of dollars because someone hurt his feelings when he was younger than I am now. Watched my 90-year-old great-aunt manage an entire room of adults like she was the only one in the room who'd ever been to a meeting before." A pause. "It's better than I expected, honestly." The laugh that came out of me surprised us both. I reached over and put my hand on the back of his neck, the way I had when he was small, briefly, the gesture of physical contact that fathers make with their sons when words run short. He didn't pull away. "I should have told you years ago," I said. "Yeah," he agreed. "You should have. I'm telling you now. Yeah." He looked back at the dark window. "You are." There was a stretch of quiet that was comfortable in the way that the quiet between two people can be comfortable when something important has been said and both parties understand they are now in the same territory, however imperfectly mapped. Outside, the prairie darkness below the plain was interrupted periodically by the lights of small towns, grain elevators and gas stations, and houses where people I would never know were doing the ordinary things people do in the evenings of their lives. Marcus eventually tilted his seat back and closed his eyes, and I sat in the particular quiet of having said the things that needed to be said, and having the evidence in the even breathing of my sleeping son beside me, that what I'd feared would break something had instead made it more solid. I thought about my father in that Calgary convocation hall. I thought about him scanning the rows of graduates and not seeing the face he was looking for, and getting up at the end and taking the train home and telling himself that his son had chosen differently, and that was his right. I thought about how much courage it takes to keep going to a hall where you know in all probability you will not find what you are looking for, because the not going would be worse, would mean admitting a finality that the going, however futile, defers. He had gone, and I had not known, and now I knew, and it was both too late and somehow not entirely too late. 3 months after the reunion, Patricia sent Marcus and Emma a completed family tree spanning 6 generations, along with a package that arrived in a flat envelope and contained photocopies of immigration records from 1923, the original business license application from my grandfather's first restaurant in 1961, a photograph of the family outside that restaurant at its opening, and a separate envelope addressed to me personally. Inside my envelope was a photograph I had never seen, my parents at their own wedding, 1968, standing outside the restaurant where their reception had been held. My mother in a dress that was clearly homemade and beautiful, my father looking at her with the expression of a man who cannot believe his good fortune. They were 22 and 24 years old. They were younger than Marcus is now. I sat with that photograph for a long time before I put it anywhere. I sat with it in my office on a Tuesday morning before the rest of the building arrived, the same office where I had sat with Marcus's DNA results on a Tuesday night 4 months earlier, and I let myself look at my parents as people who had not yet had children, who had not yet built or failed or reconciled or lost anything, who were simply 2 young people at the start of something they could not yet see the shape of. My mother's hands were folded in front of her, and she was half turned toward my father, with the specific posture of someone who has just been made to laugh and is still recovering from it. My father was looking directly at the camera, with the solemnity of someone who understands this is a moment worth recording. I kept that photograph in my office at North Point Capital, on the credenza behind my desk, not hidden, not prominently displayed, just there the way true things eventually need to be, present in the landscape, neither concealed nor announced, simply part of the room you live and work in. James and I exchanged emails. The content was mostly professional. He had questions about a commercial lease negotiation his restaurant group was navigating, and I gave him what guidance I could, and occasionally one of us would append a line at the end about family. His son Michael submitted an application to the University of Calgary's engineering program. I mentioned it to Marcus, who reached out to Michael directly and offered to take him to lunch during his campus visit. The lunch apparently lasted 3 hours and ended with Marcus walking him through every coffee shop and study space in the engineering building and texting me afterward. "He's going to apply. Good kid. Reminds me of you." I read that text in my car in the North Point parking garage, and I sat with it for a moment before responding. Because what Marcus had said, "reminds me of you," was a thing that his generation says easily, without the specific weight my generation attaches to it. He meant it as a compliment and as observation. He did not mean it as the complicated thing I received it as. The evidence that 28 years of absence had not prevented the continuation of whatever it is that runs through a family and shows up, unannounced, in the way a young man approaches a problem, or fills a room, or makes the people around him want to stay longer than they planned. Whatever that is, it had continued, not despite the absence, simply through it, the way water finds a way. Emma called me from her residency the following Sunday, as she always did, and for the first time in 26 years of Sunday calls. She had started calling me on Sundays from her first year of university, and we had maintained the habit without ever deciding to. She asked me about my parents, not about the family reunion, which she had processed privately in the way she processed most things, with interior thoroughness before external expression. She asked me specifically about my parents as people, what my mother had been like, what my father had cared about, what the two of them had been together. I talked for 40 minutes. I had not talked about my parents for 28 years, and I discovered, talking to Emma, that the things I remembered were sharper and more specific than I had expected. The way my mother held her coffee cup with both hands on Sunday mornings. My father's habit of reading the newspaper twice, once quickly to get the facts, and once more slowly to figure out what he thought about them. The specific smell of my mother's kitchen on the afternoons when she baked, a smell that had been entirely absent from my adult life and that returned to me now in the describing of it, with a vividness that surprised me. The argument my parents had every year in December about whether to have the family dinner at home or at the restaurant, which they conducted with complete seriousness while everyone who knew them understood it would resolve the same way every year, as my mother's position always prevailed, because the restaurant closed at 9 and the family stayed until midnight. Emma listened to all of it. She asked questions that were specific and well-placed. The physician's habit of asking the questions that open the story rather than the ones that close it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I wish I'd known them." "I wish you had too," I said. The scholarship I had established at the University of Calgary, the one for first-generation business students, the ones building something from nothing without a family network to catch them, Marcus joined the selection committee in its second year. We spent a Saturday morning in my home office in March, reading applications together, and somewhere during the third hour of it, he looked up from a folder and said, "This one's you." He slid it across the desk. A young woman from a small city in Saskatchewan, first in her family to go to university, paying her way through with 2 jobs, and the absolute conviction that she was going to build something worth building. We funded 17 students that second year. You can build a new foundation. You can choose a new name, a new city, a new version of the story you carry. You can do this with entirely legal means and entirely good intentions, and for a long time you can tell yourself that the past is behind you, because it is behind you in the temporal sense, meaning that it happened before the present moment and therefore occupies a different position on the timeline. What you cannot do, what I learned at 52 years old in a hotel ballroom in Vancouver, watching my son cross a room toward a cousin he'd found through a DNA database, is prevent the past from being simultaneous with the present. The family tree doesn't know about your clean break. The database doesn't care about your fresh start. The blood running in your children's veins carries the entire history, whether you have disclosed it or not, and sooner or later, if you are lucky, and I mean this with complete sincerity, lucky, it finds its way back to the light. Sooner or later, if you're lucky, your son sends you a text at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, breathless with the discovery of 47 matches, excited about people he has never met, building a family tree with the same methodical enthusiasm he brings to everything he loves. And you sit in the dark of your office for 37 seconds, counting the distance between the lightning and the thunder, and then you type, Sure, son, send them over, and you begin. There's something profound about what DNA tests have introduced into our cultural experience of identity and family that I think deserves a moment before we close. Researchers who study family disclosure and intergenerational secrets have found consistently that the families who adapt most successfully to revealed concealment are not the ones where the revelation is smoothest or least painful. They are the families where the response to revelation is honest and proportional, where the person who held the secret takes responsibility without defensiveness, and where the people who receive the truth are given space to process it without being asked to skip the complicated part and go straight to forgiveness. What the science tells us, and what my own experience confirms, is that secrets kept to protect others almost always contain a proportion of self-protection too. That is not a condemnation. Humans are motivated by a complicated mixture of altruism and self-interest in proportions that shift depending on the moment and the person, and most of the time we genuinely cannot separate which is driving us. What matters is what we do when the moment of truth arrives, whether we add another wall or whether we finally walk through the door. Marcus opened a door by sending a DNA kit. I walked through it by standing up in a hotel ballroom and telling the truth to the people I had withheld it from. Those are not equivalent actions, and I want to be clear about that. My son showed more courage in his innocent curiosity than I showed in 28 years of managed concealment. The things our children do without knowing they're doing anything remarkable are sometimes the bravest things that happen in our families. If you're carrying something, a name that was changed, a family that was left behind, a version of the past that you've been protecting people from, I am not here to tell you that disclosure is always right or always the moment has come. I am here to tell you that the moment will come regardless, and that who you are when it arrives is the only thing in the story you can actually control. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach the people who need these kinds of stories. And leave a comment, especially if you've ever had one of those moments where something you thought was safely in the past came walking through the door. I read every single one. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because we post stories like this every week, and I'd hate for you to miss one. And wherever you're watching from, whatever time it is there, whether it's a Tuesday night and you're supposed to be working, or a Saturday morning with your first cup of coffee, or 3 in the morning because sleep is sometimes the thing that makes room for thinking, thank you for being here. The video on screen right now is one I think you're going to want to watch immediately. I am not going to tell you more than that, except that it involves a family secret kept for longer than mine, a revelation that arrives from a completely unexpected direction, and a moment of justice that people in the comments have been calling the most satisfying thing they have ever seen on this channel. Don't let it play without you.